I was holding a paper cup of lukewarm coffee when my millionaire son wrapped his arms around me at his Christmas party and said, "Enjoying the $5,000 a month, Mom?" I remember the exact way the words landed, light on his tongue, heavy in my chest, like he was asking if I liked the weather or the music, something simple, something normal. And for a moment, I thought I had misheard him because nothing about my life had felt like $5,000 a month. Not the drafty apartment with the rattling heater, not the way I measured out my prescriptions to make them last until the next refill, not the way I turned off lights as soon as I left a room as if electricity itself were a luxury I couldn't quite afford. So I pulled back just enough to look at him, and I said, "What money?" And I tried to smile when I said it, tried to make it sound like a joke, like maybe I was the one who'd forgotten something. But Daniel didn't laugh. His expression flickered, just for a second, and behind him I caught sight of Vanessa standing near the edge of the living room. Her champagne glass paused halfway to her lips, her eyes not on me but on him, sharp and calculating in a way that made something deep inside me shift quietly out of place. The house was glowing with soft white lights and polished decorations, the kind you see in magazines, tall ceilings, a tree that must have been at least 10 feet high covered in ornaments that looked too delicate to touch. And everywhere I looked there were people laughing, holding glasses, talking about vacations and investments and things I hadn't been part of for a very long time. I had spent 20 minutes earlier figuring out where to put my coat because no one had noticed me arrive. Not really, just a few polite smiles, a quick, "Merry Christmas," and then back to conversations that didn't include me. I had told myself it was fine, that Daniel was busy, that this was his world now and I was just visiting. But now he was standing in front of me talking about money I had never seen, money that apparently had been sent to me regularly, enough to change everything, and I could feel the room narrowing, the sound of laughter dimming as my mind tried to catch up. "The transfers," he said, lowering his voice slightly like we were sharing something obvious. "I've been sending it every month for the past year and a half." And there it was again, that quiet certainty in his tone, like this was a fact we both lived inside, like this was something he had done for me, something I had accepted without question, and I shook my head slowly, still trying to keep my voice steady. "Daniel, I haven't received anything like that." And as I said it, I saw something change in his face, not anger, not yet, but confusion, real confusion, the kind that doesn't belong at a Christmas party, the kind that makes everything else feel suddenly staged, like we were standing in the middle of a scene that had gone wrong. And behind him, Vanessa finally lowered her glass, her smile returning too quickly, too smoothly, as if she had just remembered the role she was supposed to play. And in that moment, standing there, in a room full of warmth that didn't quite reach me, I realized that whatever my son believed he had given me, it had never reached my hands, and somehow, I had been living without it while someone else had known exactly where it was going. I did not argue with him, not there, not in a room filled with strangers who knew my son as a success story but did not know the woman who raised him. I simply looked at him and then at her, and I said quietly, "Then we should check." And the way Vanessa's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass was so slight that anyone else might have missed it. But I did not. Not anymore. Not after that moment when everything inside me had shifted from confusion to something colder, something more observant. Daniel nodded quickly, almost relieved, as if facts would fix this, as if numbers would smooth over whatever misunderstanding had just appeared between us. "Yes, I can show you," he said, already reaching for his phone, and I stepped back slightly, giving him space, because suddenly I wanted to see everything, not just hear it. The music continued behind us, soft and cheerful, completely out of place with the quiet tension forming in that small circle. And as Daniel scrolled through his banking app, I found myself thinking about my apartment, about the way the kitchen light flickered every time I turned it on, about the envelope of bills I kept in a drawer that I opened only once a week, because looking at them too often made it harder to breathe. I thought about the winter coat I had worn for the past 3 years, the one with the lining starting to come loose at the seams, and I wondered how a life like that could exist at the same time as $5,000 a month. Daniel turned the screen toward me, his finger tapping at a list of transactions. "See, right here," he said, and I leaned in, my eyes slower than they used to be, but still sharp enough to read the numbers, the dates, the amounts. $5,000 every month, consistent, precise, like a promise kept on time, and next to each transfer was a name. My name, Margaret Hayes. I felt something hollow open up in my chest, not shock this time, but recognition, because the name was right, but the reality was not. I had never seen that money, never touched it, never even suspected it existed. That is not my account, I said, keeping my voice steady, and Daniel frowned, zooming in. It has your name, he insisted, and I nodded slowly. Yes, but it is not mine. And that was when I heard Vanessa laugh, soft, controlled, just enough to draw attention without seeming concerned. Maybe there is just some confusion, she said, stepping closer. Now, her tone smooth, practiced. Margaret, you know how complicated these things can be. Maybe the bank set something up for you, and you did not realize. I turned to look at her fully then. Really look at her, at the way her smile did not quite reach her eyes, at the way she positioned herself slightly between Daniel and me, as if she were guiding the conversation without appearing to, and I remembered small things. Things I had dismissed before, the way she had offered to help me sort through my mail after Daniel bought the apartment for me, the way she had insisted it would be easier if she handled certain paperwork, just to make sure everything is organized, she had said, and I had agreed, because I trusted her, because she was family, because it had seemed like kindness at the time. Daniel shook his head now, clearly trying to make sense of it. No, I set this up directly, he said, more to himself than to either of us. My assistant handled the paperwork, but everything was supposed to go straight to you. And there it was again, supposed to, a word that suddenly felt heavier than any number on that screen. I folded my hands in front of me to keep them from trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of understanding slowly settling into place. Then we should call the bank, I said, calm, clear, leaving no room for argument. And for the first time that evening, Vanessa did not speak right away. She just watched me, her expression unreadable, and in that silence, I realized that whatever had been hidden for the past 18 months was no longer entirely under her control. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding, and I could see the shift in him, the moment where confidence gave way to something more uncertain, more careful. Yes, we can call them, he said, but his voice was lower now, less certain than before, and he glanced briefly at Vanessa as if expecting her to step in again, but she only smiled, a little tighter this time, and said, of course, that is probably the easiest way to clear this up, her tone light, almost dismissive, as if this were nothing more than a minor misunderstanding that would be resolved in minutes. But I had already begun to notice the way she chose her words, always soft, always reasonable, always just enough to guide the situation without appearing to control it. And I stepped slightly away from them, toward the edge of the living room where the noise softened just enough for a conversation to feel private. Though I was aware that a few nearby guests had begun to notice, their voices lowering their attention drifting toward us in quiet curiosity. Daniel dialed the number, his thumb tapping against the phone in a rhythm that betrayed his growing tension. And while we waited for someone to answer, I let my gaze drift across the room again, over the polished surfaces, the carefully arranged decorations, the life my son had built, and I felt no envy, only a quiet distance, like looking at something through glass, something that had once belonged to me, but no longer did. Hi. Yes, I need to verify some transfer details, Daniel said when the call connected, his voice shifting into that efficient tone I had heard him use on business calls, clear, controlled, almost detached, and he stepped a little farther from the crowd, motioning for me to come closer so I could hear. Vanessa followed, not too close, but close enough, always within reach of the conversation, always present, always watching. Daniel confirmed his identity, then began listing the transactions, the monthly transfers, the amounts, the recipient name, and I listened carefully, not to the numbers, but to the pauses, the small changes in his tone as the person on the other end responded. There was a moment, a brief one, where his brow furrowed, and he glanced at me again, confusion deepening into something sharper. Yes, that is correct, he said slowly. Margaret Hayes. And then another pause, longer this time, and I felt it before he spoke, that subtle shift when a story begins to unravel. No, that is not the address I have on file, he added, his voice tightening just enough to be noticeable. I stood very still, my hands folded, my breathing steady, because I knew now that this was not a mistake, not something simple or accidental. This was something constructed, something maintained over time. And as Daniel listened, his posture changed, his shoulders straightening, his attention narrowing, the way it used to when he was a boy trying to understand something that did not make sense. "Can you repeat that?" he asked, and the room seemed to quiet around us. Not completely, but enough that the distance between what was being said on that phone and what had been believed until this moment became impossible to ignore. Vanessa shifted her weight slightly, her expression still composed, but her eyes sharper now, calculating faster, and I could almost see the thoughts moving behind them, adjusting, rearranging, searching for a way to contain what was slipping out of her control. Daniel ended the call a few seconds later, not abruptly, but with a kind of careful precision, like he was placing something fragile down rather than letting it fall. And when he looked at me, the certainty was gone, replaced by something else entirely, something closer to realization. "Mom," he said quietly, "the account is under your name, but the contact information, the address, the access points, they are not yours." He paused, as if even saying it out loud required him to accept it fully. "Someone has been managing it." And he did not look at Vanessa when he said it, but he did not need to, because for the first time since I arrived that evening, the silence between the three of us said everything that words had not yet caught up to. Vanessa was the first to break the silence, and she did it with a soft laugh that did not quite match the tension in the air. "That sounds like a simple administrative mix-up," she said, stepping forward just enough to place herself beside Daniel, not touching him, but close enough to feel like a united front. "These things happen all the time with banks, especially when accounts are set up through assistants or third parties." Her voice was calm, reassuring, the kind of tone that usually smoothed things over. But tonight it felt rehearsed, like a line she had used before in smaller, less noticeable situations. Daniel did not respond immediately. He kept looking at his phone as if the answers might rearrange themselves if he stared long enough, and I watched him carefully, the way his jaw tightened slightly, the way his thumb hovered over the screen without moving. He was thinking now, not reacting, and that was something Vanessa had not expected. "They confirmed the address," he said finally, his voice quieter, more deliberate. "It is not Mom's apartment. It is a different property." He lifted his eyes then, not toward me, but toward her, and for the first time, there was a question in his gaze that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with her. Vanessa did not look away. She held his gaze with that same composed expression, but I could see the calculation behind it, the quick adjustments, the careful selection of what to say. "Next, Daniel, you are reading too much into this," she replied gently, placing a light hand on his arm. "We should not jump to conclusions in the middle of a party." Her words were reasonable, almost protective, but they landed differently now, because the facts were no longer abstract. They were specific, measurable, undeniable. I felt something settle inside me then, not anger, not even betrayal in the way I had once imagined it, but a quiet clarity, like a fog lifting to reveal something that had been there all along. I thought back to the months after Daniel had moved me into the apartment, how Vanessa had visited often at first, always offering help, always bringing small things, groceries, documents, suggestions. She had insisted on organizing my mail, said it would be easier for everyone if important letters were forwarded through her. "Just so nothing gets lost," she had told me. And I had agreed because it sounded practical, because I trusted her, because I wanted to believe that kindness did not come with conditions. Daniel exhaled slowly, as if he were trying to steady himself. "No," he said, more firmly this time. "This is not just a mix-up." And he turned the phone slightly, so that both of us could see, scrolling through the details again, confirming what had already been said, the address, the contact number, the access credentials, all of it aligned with one thing. Not me, not my life, not my reality. Vanessa withdrew her hand from his arm, just slightly, but enough to create a space between them that had not been there before. And in that space, something fragile began to crack. I did not step forward. I did not raise my voice. I simply spoke, calm and steady. "I never received a single statement," I said, and the words hung there, simple, undeniable. Daniel looked at me then, fully, really seeing me in a way he had not in a long time, taking in the details he had overlooked, the worn edges of my coat draped over a nearby chair, the careful way I held my purse as if it contained everything I could not afford to lose, the quiet signs of a life lived without the support he believed he had given, and I saw it register in him, slowly but completely. Vanessa opened her mouth to speak again, but stopped, just for a second, and that hesitation was louder than anything she could have said, because it was the first time she had not had an immediate answer, the first time the situation had moved beyond her control, and in that moment, surrounded by lights and music and people who were beginning to sense that something was wrong, I understood that the truth was no longer something hidden in small details. It was right there between us, waiting for someone to acknowledge it out loud. Daniel did not look away from me this time, and that was how I knew something inside him had shifted in a way that could not be undone. He was not seeing the situation anymore as a misunderstanding that needed to be smoothed over. He was seeing it as a problem that needed to be solved. And more importantly, he was starting to see me, not as a figure in the background of his life, but as someone standing directly in front of him, affected by something real, something measurable. "Mom," he said. Again, slower now, as if each word required more care. "Have you ever signed anything, any documents, any forms related to this account?" And I shook my head without hesitation, because the answer was simple. "No," I said. "If I had, I would remember." And that was the truth. I had signed very few things in the past 2 years, and each one had been deliberate, cautious, necessary. Vanessa let out a small breath, almost a sigh, as if she were tired of the direction the conversation was taking. "Margaret, you might not recall everything," she said, her tone still controlled, but there was a faint edge to it now, something sharper beneath the surface. "There were times when paperwork needed to be handled quickly, and I stepped in to help. You trusted me with that." She paused, as if offering me a way to agree, a way to make this easier, to fold the situation back into something manageable, but I did not take it. I simply looked at her and said, "I trusted you to help, not to replace me." And the words were quiet, but they landed with a weight that made Daniel straighten slightly beside her. Vanessa's smile faltered for the briefest moment, then returned, thinner, more deliberate. "No one replaced you," she replied, but she did not explain further, and that absence of explanation was louder than any denial. Daniel turned his attention back to his phone, scrolling again, but this time his movements were different, more precise, more focused, as if he were searching for something specific rather than simply reviewing what he had already believed. "There are authorization logs," he said, almost to himself. "Access records, changes to contact details." He tapped on the screen, his brow furrowing deeper. These updates were made months after the account was opened. And then he stopped, his finger hovering over a line of text, and I watched as realization moved across his face, not suddenly, but in stages, like a series of doors opening one after another. "The contact number," he said slowly. "It is linked to your phone plan." He looked up at Vanessa, not accusing, not yet, but asking, truly asking, "Why would your number be listed as the primary contact for Mom's account?" Vanessa did not answer immediately, and in that pause, the room seemed to hold its breath. The music still played, people still talked, glasses still clinked, but around us there was a quiet space where everything felt suspended, waiting. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question carefully, as if this were still something she could explain away. "Because I was helping manage things," she said finally, her voice even, controlled. "You asked me to make sure everything was taken care of, remember?" Daniel did not nod this time. He did not immediately accept the answer. Instead, he looked back at the screen, then at me, then at her again, and I could see the pieces not quite fitting anymore. "Helping manage does not mean redirecting everything," he said, and there was something new in his tone now, something firmer, something less willing to be guided. I remained where I was, my posture steady, my hands still, because I understood that this moment did not belong to anger or accusation. It belonged to clarity, and clarity had its own pace, its own way of unfolding. I thought about the nights I had sat at my small kitchen table, balancing bills with a pencil and a notepad, choosing which ones could wait, which ones could not. I thought about the times I had declined invitations because I could not afford the gas to drive across town. And all the while, somewhere, there had been money in my name, moving, accumulating, being used, Just not by me. Daniel inhaled slowly, then exhaled, as if steadying himself before stepping into something he could no longer avoid. We are not going to resolve this tonight, he said, his voice measured, controlled. But we are going to resolve it. And when he said it, he was not speaking to both of us equally. He was looking at Vanessa, and for the first time that evening, she did not try to soften his words. She did not interrupt. She simply met his gaze, and in that silence, I understood that whatever had been hidden behind quiet management and polite explanations was now exposed enough that it could not simply be folded back into the background of our lives. The rest of the party continued as if nothing had changed, but for me, the air felt different, heavier, like every sound had to travel through something thick before it reached me. Daniel slipped his phone into his pocket, his expression composed but distant, and I recognized that look because I had seen it years ago when he was a young man trying to solve problems on his own, shutting everything else out until he could make sense of what stood in front of him. I need some time to go through everything, he said quietly, more to himself than to either of us, and then louder, more formal. I will have my office pull the full records in the morning. Vanessa nodded immediately, too quickly. That is a good idea, she said, her tone supportive again, almost relieved to have a delay, to move this out of the present moment and into something that could be managed later, reshaped, explained. I watched her carefully now, not with suspicion anymore, but with understanding, the kind that comes when small, scattered memories begin to align into something clear. I remembered the first time she had offered to handle my mail, how she had stood in my doorway with a warm smile and a grocery bag in her hand, telling me she knew how overwhelming paperwork could be, especially after everything I had been through. And I had believed her because it sounded kind, because it sounded like care. I remembered how she had suggested switching some of my documents to electronic statements. It is safer, she had said. Nothing gets lost that way. And I had agreed because I did not want to be a burden, because I thought I was making things easier for everyone. I even remembered the day she had brought a small stack of papers and asked me to sign them quickly before Daniel arrived. Just routine updates, she had said. Nothing important. And I had signed where she pointed, trusting the way she guided the pen, trusting the way she explained things in simple terms. And now, standing there in a room filled with people who had no idea what was unfolding just a few feet away, I could see those moments differently, not as isolated acts of help, but as steps in a process, quiet, consistent, deliberate. Daniel glanced at me again, and this time his eyes lingered a little longer, as if he were seeing more than just the present, as if he were starting to reconsider the past as well. Mom, did Vanessa ever bring you documents to sign? He asked, and his voice was careful, not accusing, but searching, and I nodded slowly. A few times, I said. She said they were updates, things you had already approved. Vanessa let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. Daniel, that is normal, she said, her tone firmer now. You were busy, you asked me to handle things. I made sure everything was taken care of, including making it easier for your mother. Daniel did not respond right away, and that silence stretched just long enough to feel significant. I could see the tension building in the space between them. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady, undeniable, like a crack forming beneath a surface that had once seemed solid. I shifted my weight slightly, adjusting my purse on my shoulder, and in that small movement I felt something else settle inside me. Not fear, not even sadness, but a quiet decision. I was no longer going to assume that things would be handled for me. I was no longer going to accept explanations without understanding them. I want to be present when you review everything, I said, my voice calm, steady, and Daniel nodded immediately. Of course, he replied, without hesitation, and that was when I noticed Vanessa's expression change again, just slightly, a flicker of something sharper, something less controlled, because this was no longer a situation she could manage on her own, no longer something she could filter or redirect. This was moving into the open, into a space where every detail would be examined. And for the first time since the conversation had begun, I saw not confidence in her eyes, but calculation mixed with something else, something closer to concern, and I realized that whatever had been carefully maintained over the past year and a half was now facing something it had not been designed to withstand, full attention from all sides. The conversation did not continue the way conversations usually do at family gatherings. There was no quick resolution, no laughter to smooth over the edges. Instead, there was a quiet agreement to pause, to move forward later, and that silence followed me even as I stepped away from them. Even as I picked up my coat and made my way toward the door, I did not say goodbye to many people, just a few polite nods, a soft smile here and there, because I could feel that whatever had just begun was not something that belonged in a room filled with music and decoration. It belonged somewhere quieter, somewhere where the truth could unfold without interruption. The night air outside was cold, sharper than I expected, and I stood there for a moment on the front steps, letting it settle around me, letting my thoughts slow down enough to line up in a way that made sense. Daniel followed a minute later, not rushing, but not hesitating either. "I will drive you home," he said, and I nodded because there was no reason to refuse. The ride was quiet at first, the kind of silence that is not empty but full of things waiting to be said, full of questions that had not yet been formed into words. The city lights passed by the window in long stretches of gold and white, reflecting faintly on the glass, and I watched them without really seeing them. "I should have checked sooner," Daniel said finally, his voice low, steady, but carrying something heavier underneath. "I assumed everything was working the way it was supposed to." I did not respond right away, not because I did not have anything to say, but because I wanted to choose my words carefully, the way I had learned to do over the years. "You trusted the system you set up," I said after a moment, "and you trusted the person you asked to help manage it." He exhaled slowly, his hands tightening slightly on the steering wheel. "That does not excuse it," he replied, and there was a quiet determination in his tone now, something that had not been there earlier, something that told me he was no longer looking for simple explanations. When we reached my apartment building, he parked and turned off the engine, but neither of us moved to get out right away. The car sat in silence, the faint hum of the cooling engine the only sound between us. "Tomorrow, I am going to pull everything," he said, turning to face me fully now. "Every transfer, every authorization, every document, and I want you there when we go through it." I nodded, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I will be there," I said, and I meant it, not just as a promise to him, but as a commitment to myself. He hesitated for a moment, then added, "If there is anything you remember, anything that felt off, even if it seemed small at the time, I need to know." I thought about that, about all the small moments I had dismissed, all the times I had chosen to trust instead of question, and I realized there were more of them than I had allowed myself to see. "I will think about it," I said quietly, and then I reached for the door handle, stepping out into the cold night. The air felt different now, not just cold, but clear, like something had shifted inside me as well. I was no longer standing outside of my own life, observing it. From a distance, I was stepping back into it, fully aware, fully present, and as I walked toward my building, I knew that whatever had been taken from me had not just been money, it had been time, trust, and the quiet belief that things were being handled in my best interest. And now, for the first time in a long while, I was ready to take that back, piece by piece, without raising my voice, without making a scene, just by paying attention, by asking questions, and by no longer accepting answers that did not feel true. The next morning did not feel like a continuation of the night before. It felt like the beginning of something entirely different, something quieter but far more precise. I woke up earlier than usual, not out of habit, but because my mind had already moved ahead of me, sorting through details, replaying conversations, placing small memories side by side until they formed something clearer than they ever had before. I made coffee and sat at my small kitchen table, the same table where I had spent months calculating what I could afford and what I had to postpone, and for the first time, I looked at it differently, not as a place of limitation, but as a place where I had unknowingly endured something I should never have had to endure. I opened the drawer where I kept my papers, bills, receipts, notices, and I began to go through them slowly, not searching for anything specific at first, just observing, just noticing. There were gaps, spaces where documents should have been, months, where I had received nothing at all. And I remembered how Vanessa had said that electronic statements were safer, how she had assured me that everything was being handled, that I did not need to worry. I set those papers aside and reached for my phone. scrolling through old messages, looking for patterns, for timing, for anything that might connect what I had experienced to what Daniel had discovered. There were texts from Vanessa, polite, efficient, always offering help, always phrased in a way that made it easy to say yes, easy to trust, and I could see now how consistent it had been, how intentional, each message building on the last, creating a system where I gradually stepped back while she stepped in, not all at once, not in a way that would raise concern, but slowly, carefully, the way something changes over time until one day it no longer resembles what it used to be. When Daniel arrived, he did not come alone. He brought a folder, thick, organized, and a quiet seriousness that matched the moment. We sat across from each other at my table, and for a brief second, I saw a glimpse of the boy he used to be, sitting there with something important to say, something he had prepared for. I had my office pull everything, he said, placing the folder between us. Bank records, authorization logs, account changes, everything tied to your name. He opened it carefully, not rushing, as if each page carried weight. And in a way, it did. He turned the first few pages toward me, pointing out the transfers, the consistency, the amounts. Nothing new there, nothing we had not already seen. But then he moved deeper into the file, to sections that had not been visible before. This is where it changes, he said, and his voice lowered slightly, not out of fear, but out of focus. There were documents, authorization forms, signatures, digital confirmations, and I leaned closer, studying them. Not just the content, but the details, the dates, the timing. And then I saw it, my name, written in a way that looked like mine at first glance, but felt different when I looked closer, the strokes slightly off, the rhythm not quite right. I did not sign this, I said quietly, and Daniel nodded once, as if he had been waiting for that confirmation. I know, he replied, and he turned another page, showing me the contact information linked to the account, the phone number, Vanessa's, the email address, one I did not recognize, but one that followed a pattern, something constructed, something controlled. I felt no rush of anger, no surge of emotion, just a steady clarity, like pieces falling into place exactly where they belonged. She set this up to look like me, I said, more as a statement than a question, and Daniel did not correct me. He simply continued turning pages, each one adding another layer, another detail, another confirmation, until there was no space left for doubt, no room for explanation that could soften what we were seeing. I sat back slightly, folding my hands in my lap, not to steady myself, but to acknowledge what was now fully visible, not just to him, but to me as well. And in that quiet kitchen, with sunlight filtering through the window and landing softly on the table between us, I realized that the truth did not arrive loudly. It arrived piece by piece, quietly, until it was impossible to ignore. And now that it was here, fully formed, there was only one thing left to do: face it directly, without hesitation, without looking away. We did not speak for a few moments after the last page was turned, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that needed to be understood was already there between us, laid out in ink and numbers and signatures that did not belong to me. Daniel closed the folder slowly, his movements controlled, deliberate, as if he were containing something that could not be allowed to spill over into emotion just yet. I have already contacted legal, he said finally, his voice steady, but lower than before. They are reviewing everything, and the bank has flagged the account for investigation. I nodded once, not out of approval, but acknowledgement, because this was no longer about discovery. It was about consequence, and consequence had its own process, its own pace. Does she know? I asked, and Daniel hesitated for the first time that morning, just briefly, before answering. Not yet. And that pause told me more than his words did. It told me he was thinking carefully about how this would unfold, not just as a financial matter, but as something that would reshape the structure of his life. She will, he added, more firmly, and I could hear the shift in him again. That same quiet determination from the night before, now clearer, more grounded. I stood up slowly, walking to the window, not to escape the conversation, but to place myself somewhere I could think clearly. The sunlight was brighter now, filling the room in a way that made everything look sharper, more defined, and I realized that was exactly what had happened to this situation. What had once been vague and assumed was now precise and undeniable. Daniel, I said, turning back to him, when you speak to her, do not ask her if this is true. He looked at me, his expression tightening slightly. Why not? He asked, and I held his gaze, steady, calm. Because the truth is already here, I said, gesturing lightly toward the folder. If you ask, you give her room to shape the answer, to adjust it, to make it sound smaller than it is. He listened without interrupting, and I continued. You do not need an explanation, you need acknowledgement. The distinction settled between us, and I could see him processing it, not resisting, but adjusting his approach. The way he used to when he learned something new that changed how he saw a problem. I understand, he said after a moment, and there was no hesitation in his voice now, just clarity. I walked back to the table, resting my hand lightly on the edge, not for support, but as a quiet anchor. I am not interested in arguments, I added. I am not interested in scenes. I only want what is mine to be returned, and for the truth to be recognized without distortion. Daniel nodded, more firmly this time. That is exactly what is going to happen, he said, and I believed him, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. There was no uncertainty left, no assumption, only intent. We sat down again, not as mother and son separated by distance and misunderstanding, but as two people facing the same reality, aligned in purpose. And for the first time since the conversation had begun the night before, I felt something settle that had nothing to do with loss. It was not relief, not yet, but it was closer to balance, the kind that comes when something hidden is finally brought into the light and seen for what it is, not exaggerated, not minimized, just real. I will handle the next steps, Daniel said, gathering the papers back into the folder. But you will be included in every part of it. I inclined my head slightly, accepting that without question, because this was no longer something I would step away from. This was something I would stand inside of, fully aware, fully present. And as he prepared to leave, I realized that the most important thing had already changed, not the money, not the account, but the way I saw my place in all of it. I was no longer someone being taken care of from a distance. I was someone who understood exactly what had been done and who would not allow it to be hidden again, not quietly, not politely, not ever.